name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. And what I want to talk about today is regime change. Because in today's world, you have basically the media, the establishment, the political establishment, agitating for war in Syria in the name of regime change. That it's up to the US to get involved to make sure that the right regimes are involved over there in Syria and that these bad regimes are removed. And while I'm not arguing whether these regimes are bad, or making the argument that they're good people who are running these regimes that could change in history. The issue isn't the regime, the issue is what happens after you remove the regime. So essentially, so you understand what regime change is in history there's been several government regimes that have either fallen out of political favor with the global establishment for whatever reason, whether they challenge the economic interests of other countries, the political interests of other countries, or just cause humanitarian suffering that the world felt it needed to get involved. So then what happens is that governments get involved, oftentimes by providing support via weapons and other resources to other factions who are looking to overthrow that group. For example, in the 50s, the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. Now, essentially what eventually happens, though, is that the new people, the people who overthrew that regime, they fall apart fairly quickly, or over time, just because the only reason they were able to come to power is because they had the assistance of other actors around the world. So they're not necessarily able to self-sustain themselves and self-sustain that power. They weren't necessarily a regime that the people organically wanted. So it's kind of like having an organ that's rejected. So then it just becomes a political mismatch and it creates instability. Oftentimes that regime falls apart, resulting in civil war. It's part of kind of what happened in Guatemala. Actually, that is what happened in Guatemala. My mom grew up during this time in Guatemala and had to firsthand watch the consequences of this. But I mean, we've seen the same thing happen in Iran, when basically the Shah was put into power, and then the Shah eventually fell out of power. In Iraq, in Libya, and now in Syria. Now, does that mean regimes should never change? No, they should change, but they need to change organically for them to be sustainable. If you take a look at places where you had sustainable transfers of power, such as Tunisia, the reason is because it was the people that overthrew their oppressive government. And the result is, the new government was a government that had the consent of the governed. So whether the consent of the governed necessarily results in a government that we approve of the values of or the approach of, basically, at the end of the day, any institution has to have the consent of its participants. Regardless of what we think a better institution would be, if it doesn't have the consent of its participants, it won't stick, it won't stay. So it's foolish to think that we can just force these kind of changes. These changes have to organically happen, and sometimes it doesn't happen as fast as we like. That's reality. Although getting involved can make things much worse. The instability, the civil wars are created by forcing change too quickly, costs a lot more lives, and usually ends up creating much worse problems, in the sense that, basically you have Al-Qaeda, and then through Al-Qaeda and several different weird events, we ended up getting involved in Iraq. But then basically destabilizing Iraq created a vacuum that led to sort of a ex-Al-Qaeda and ex-Iraqi military forming ISIS. And now the question is, what happens if you defeat ISIS, if you defeat Assad? Does that mean that that magical hole of power just magically gets filled with something better? History doesn't suggest that's probably the case. If ISIS is defeated, if Al-Qaeda is defeated, history generally suggests that someone just more violent, who takes much more drastic tactics, is going to basically take their place. Because they see, well, the last group wasn't violent enough. Their tactics weren't horrible enough, so that's why they lost. So we just need to be more horrible, more violent. That's kind of sort of how things go. You need the people to organically get there. But the more you get involved, the more instability there is, the slower they get there, and the more lives are lost, the greater enemies we end up creating in the long run. Again, ISIS was a lot worse than some of the people we've had to deal with in the past. And then they were worse than people we dealt with in the past from there. It just, you slowly create a bigger and bigger enemy. You're wasting more and more resources. And eventually you do run out of resources. And at that point, you'll have an enemy who's 10 times more dangerous than anything we have right now. And we'll be in a much worse position, much less safe. There's just really not a... There's no shortcuts. There's no shortcuts to global stability. There's no shortcuts to developing good governance and diplomatic relationships. You just have to let people and societies figure it out. In the meantime, you could create a place of asylum for those who do feel oppressed, who do feel subjugated in societies, through providing a refuge for refugees. But as far as getting involved and militarily getting involved in the regime change, again, history has not shown that this has been a good approach. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. Have a great day and enjoy.